Could you transplant the six eyes like the Sharingan and have someone else use them? Let's talk about that and several other questions I got today, but spoilers beware. All right, first of all, shout out to Mish for asking me these questions today. And to kick things off, no, I do not think that you could transplant the six eyes into somebody else so that they could wield them. And the main reason I think this is because of all of like the fate that's tied to the six eyes. We know that they are physiology, like you are born with them. They're not a curse technique or anything, but even still, we know that there's some kind of weird mumbo jumbo involved with these things. And that's because they are connected by fate to both Tengen and the star plasma vessel. And we know that when Kinjaku was trying to deal with Six Eyes users in the past, he tried a bunch of different things, including killing one right when they were born. And yet, a Six Eyes user appeared on the day of the merger still. So that tells me that like the Six Eyes probably manifested in a full-grown adult, which means there's more than just the physiology going on here. So I think you would need to be a Gojo clan member. You would need to have that kind of fated destiny to be a wielder of the six eyes, and you couldn't just plop them out from the actual limitless six eyes user, put them in your head, and expect for them to work. But that being said, we do have some nuanced things to talk about here because we actually do get to see Yuta wield the six eyes. But the important distinction is he was in Gojo's body, right? And I think that makes all the difference. So in terms of all of the fate and all of the things that are kind of bringing this together, it's still true because it's still Gojo, right? It's just someone else is actually piloting the wheels back there thanks to a very specific technique. So I think in situations like this, which there aren't really any other examples besides a weird body swap technique, you could do it. But again, just simply taking the eyes, I don't think you're going to have the right stuff to actually make them work the way they're supposed to. You're just going to have pretty blue eyes. Next up, Mij asked me a couple of questions about Yuji's mother and her curse technique, Antigravity System, which we saw Kinjaku wield, right? He wanted to know what I thought the actual lapse of that technique was, because we only ever saw Kinjaku use its reversal, which increased gravity. So I think it is anti-gravity, right? Or the reduction or complete removal of gravity, which does help explain how he was able to survive Yuki's black hole, because he was basically somewhat offsetting the insane gravitational force of what she was doing with his own anti-gravity. So yeah, I think it's just as simple as that. Then next up, I was asked, could Yuji have inherited his mother's curse technique? And theoretically, could he have? Sure, but did he? No. Like, there's no chance of that awakening later in life or anything. He would have needed to have been born with the technique. But what if he had it? Well, that'd have been a whole different story, right? I think it would be cool because I do think that technique is powerful and has a lot of potential, which is just proven by the fact that Kinjaku deemed it valuable enough to keep. Like this 1,000-year-old sorcerer who's probably had more than a few chances to body swap to pick up techniques valued anti-gravity enough to make it one of the 3 I think we see him actually use. And next up, Mij asked me if I thought that Yuki could perceive and damage the soul just like Yuji can, because we know that she was very interested and very well read on that subject. And in fact, her research on the soul helped Yuji deepen his own understanding of it. But even still, I don't think she can do anything that Yuji could do. Just because she's well-read and well-versed on a subject does not translate to being able to do things like that in practice, right? And I think the series showed us that there is a very specific way that you can learn to perceive the soul. Either you got to be like Mahito, and that's just kind of baked into who you are because of what his curse technique is. He can perceive the soul. Or you have to be like Yuji and Sukuna and have 2 souls occupying one vessel that basically forces you to gain an awareness of the shape of your soul so that you can differentiate the two, right? So I don't think Yuki would be able to emulate what Yuji did because she doesn't have that experience. Next up, Mij asked me a couple of questions about Kinjaku / Geto's domain expansion, womb perfusion. And just in case you haven't seen, I've released whole videos where we talk about this exact subject and whose domain maybe it is. So I'm not going to get all into that here, but he does say that he thinks it's Geto's domain, but it's open because of Kinjaku. Basically, Kinjaku has an open domain, but the properties of it are dependent on whose body he's in. So I agree with kind of what you're saying, but not fully, because I don't think that anyone just has an open domain. I think that you kind of achieve that with skill. So I do think that Kinjaku has a normal closed domain based upon the body swap technique, right? But because of all the nuance of body swapping and having multiple techniques, he clearly has some versatility. So whether or not what we saw was explicitly like his innate domain versus Geto's innate domain versus the sure hit actually imbued into it is a whole bunch of other questions. And again, I've got videos on that. But I do think that he's capable of doing an open or a closed domain regardless of whose technique he's actually using. And then Mij's final question was, what do you think a full potential Wheat would look like? And I got you covered because I already did a whole video on his full potential, and it's one of my favorites, so check that out. Then last but not least, I got this question from Bradley, which was, what if Yuta had taken both Ryu and Naoya's curse techniques? And this would be interesting, right? I would have loved to have seen Yuta accumulate more and more techniques. And we've talked about like why he doesn't necessarily have more, and it's based on the conditions he has to meet. But in Ryu's case, it was kind of like they sort of parted amicably. And, you know, he's not just going to have Rika go eat Ryu's arm. And with Naoya, he wasn't around to potentially copy that technique, right? But as far as Ryu's technique goes, I don't know if it would be that interesting in Yuta's hands because it's just an energy blast at the end of the day. Is it strong? Sure, but we know that Rika can already do like the pure love beam, even though we didn't really see Yuta use that post JJK0. But I just don't think that offers him really any new interesting utility on top of what he can already do. But for Naoya, the projection sorcery would have been really cool to see in Yuta's hands. Like, it singularly doesn't represent enough to like drastically change the shape of the story, in my opinion, because primarily we're thinking like, what would it do against Sukuna, right? And I think that, you know, he would adapt to it pretty quickly. Like, maybe they could have used projection sorcery to get off 1 or 2 1-second stuns on Sukuna, because that's what happens if you like disobey the projection laws, right? You get frozen for 1 second, which essentially Curse Speech accomplished that position within the story by telling him to freeze or stop, right? But yeah, I also just think that Sukuna, he might adapt to it immediately, just with like as much of a genius as he is and how fast he is. Like, I think that he could have very quickly picked up on projection sorcery anyway, but still, it would have been cool to see him use it. Anyways, y'all, that's going to do it for this one. As always, let me know all of your thoughts and comments down below. Like, do you think that you could transplant the 6 eyes into somebody else and they would still work? Or do you need to have that kind of cosmic fate on your side? I didn't mention this earlier, but honestly, I think the only other possible way you could maybe do this would be if the recipient of the transplant was also a Gojo clan member. Like, then maybe, but even still, I think there's just more going on there. But y'all let me know your thoughts, and as always, thank you for watching.